Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to have so many people here. On behalf of Rabbi Harris had to be at another program, so I'm representing both of us tonight. On behalf of the Temple and the Jewish Federation, we're thrilled to be doing this program together and excited to add new programming for the community in the evening. This is the first of two sessions. It's a two-session series. The next one will be in 2 weeks on February 18th at the same time and with the same link you used tonight. So save that email, or you can go to our webpage and register again and you'll get the same email. But it is the same link on the 18th. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Zemer and let her get started for this exciting program. So Zemer Sweenie is the music director at Temple B'nai Israel, where she leads music for worship, directs adult and youth choirs, directs the Hebrew school, tutors B'nai mitzvah students, and teaches a variety of classes for children and adults. In addition, she and her husband Glenn and bass player Randy Doit formed the contemporary Jewish band Shir Balev, Hebrew for song in the heart, and have led worship and played concerts throughout the Midwest for the last 18 years. A nationally recognized composer and arranger, Zemer Sweenie is a proud member of the Women Cantors Network, and her catalog of original compositions is licensed for use through J License. I'm going to remind everyone who's able to please mute yourself, and we are going to turn the evening over to Zemer.
Okay, well, I have one question for you, Roberta. I keep hearing ringing when somebody enters the room. Is that coming from your microphone, or is that coming? I don't know why I hear that. I've never heard that sound before. So I can't hear you, Roberta. Can you unmute yourself? She can't.
Sorry. It is, I was following my rule about muting. It is a setting, I think, on our end. I will see if I can change it. I don't know if I can with us started, but I will try.
Okay. Don't worry about it. Once people come in, it'll stop. So I was just, as I said earlier, I'm very easily distracted. So just so that you know that. So I am thrilled and a little bit intimidated by having so many people having signed up for this class. I'm humbled by the level of interest and I'm excited about it, but I have two disclaimers. One of the disclaimers is that I've never taught this many people on Zoom before. I've led services for this many people on Zoom before. And I've taught on Zoom before, but not for this many people. So it's going to be a whole level of new experience for me. And I hope that I'll very humbly that you're patient with me on this. What I would like is for you not to use the chat box until I ask you to use the chat box. So there will be times when I will pause and see if anyone has questions. If you want to put them in the chat box, that would be great. And if you don't know how to use the chat box, which some of you may not, you can raise your hand. And I know that Rachel and Roberta are going to keep an eye on such things, and I'll make sure that I get to your questions. And that brings me to my second disclaimer, and that is that I am not a formal scholar on the subject of Jewish roots in American popular music. So when you have questions that I can't answer, I will find the answer for you and I will get back to you if I don't have it. So the reason that I teach these classes is, though, that from the time I was a very, very small child, and I mean like in the playpen, if people remember playpen, I was surrounded by a family that absolutely loved popular music. I grew up in New York, and I went to shows with I had an uncle who was like Auntie Mame and used to take me to Broadway shows all the time from the time I was a little girl. And I was just in love with popular music. and I just soaked it all up like a sponge. My husband will tell you, I know the words to songs. I don't even know how I know all these words. But as I got older, because I was so interested in the genre, I would read anything I could get my hands on about the composers and about their lives. And I was always amazed at how many Jewish composers there were relative to the amount of popular music, what a huge force they were. And it also made me so proud to be Jewish, to know that I was, a part of a group that could bring up about these amazing talents. So when I began to pursue my career as a Jewish music professional, I started then to go from just loving that music to learning more and more about the roots of Jewish music. And I started to see more and more connections between Jewish musical roots, Jewish history, Jewish values, and the connection to those American popular music composers and the music that they wrote. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on about those subjects. And so that's where I am in terms of my scholarliness on the subject. It's the result of a lot of self-study and classes that I've taken, but it wasn't my major. So anyway, I hope over the course of the 2 classes I'll be teaching that you all will begin to get a better understanding of not only the aspects of Judaism that have influenced and continue to influence American popular music, but I also want you to get an idea of how these influences have helped to create music that is so universally popular. So what is it about Jewish melody, Jewish experience, Jewish ethics that speak to the greater population and made these songs so popular? So this week, my focus is going to be on composers of the early 20th century, so the 1920s through about the 1960s. I will tell you that this class, I could teach semesters of classes on this. So I'm not going to speak about every composer because there's just too many composers, but I'm going to give you a sampling, and then offline at some point, or if you have questions about specific composers, we can address those when I ask for questions. So this week we're going to talk about 1920s-ish to 1960s-ish. So starting with Tin Pan Alley, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then next week we're going to pick up from there and do some more modern composers, starting in the late 50s and early 60s. If you're not familiar with the Brill Building, you will be familiar with it next week. So that'll be like Carole King and Paul Simon and all the way to Pink, who, yes, she is Jewish, and the Beastie Boys, who were multiply Jewish. So anyway, with that, that's my introduction and my disclaimers. So please be patient with technology. We all love it. I'm going to start, before I start talking about the main subject matter, I want to do a little bit of a history of how these composers got to be who they were and how they got to do what they did. So during the early part of the 20th century, there was obviously, you all know, a huge influx of Eastern European Jews who emigrated to the United States to escape the pogroms for their own safety. So they came here for their safety, and they came here for opportunities that they wouldn't have in the old country. And while they certainly found safety here, the opportunities were quite limited because of anti-immigrant sentiments in general, and specifically anti-Semitic sentiments. So, you all know that many of our Eastern European ancestors, grandparents and great-grandparents, they made their way by becoming merchants or by becoming grocers, somewhere where they could start their own business. They weren't relying on somebody to hire them, so they would start their own businesses if they were able to do that. and then work their way up and develop those businesses. And they were service businesses, again, like merchants or grocers, so that they could not only serve the Jewish community, but the greater community. So that was one way that they could achieve success. Another way was through the arts, particularly through music. And the reason for that is I know myself personally as a musician, I don't care, who the person is, what the person looks like, whatever the person is. If they're playing a lick on the guitar that I think is cool and I want to learn it, that person is now my new best friend, and we're going to learn from each other. And so I think the arts tend to be a lot more accepting of people because as artists, as musicians, we focus on the art and not so much on the person. So it became a great equalizer. It always has been a great equalizer. And because of that, a lot of the musically inclined immigrants and sons and daughters, well, mostly sons of immigrants. There were daughters. We'll talk about that too. But most of the musically inclined were about to experience a perfect storm of opportunity to succeed as composers. And that perfect storm came in multiple parts. First of all, in the early part of the 20th century, music was enjoyed mostly in the home, right? People would be home with sitting around the piano with their little sheet music that they got, and they would sing, "Let me call you sweetheart," and they would do all those lovely songs. And so that's where music was mostly enjoyed. But starting in the 20s, there was the advent of dance halls, where people started to branch out to enjoy entertainment outside of their homes. And dance halls, and during Prohibition, there were also dance halls with lots of liquor. So there was even more, those were kind of clandestine, but there were dance halls. So people would go out and they wanted to hear music. And so suddenly it wasn't just this small niche for people to do it at home, but they needed more and more and more music. So I want you to think back to a time when we had 3 television networks.
I see one that says folks on the end.
Oops, somebody's talking. My analogy is we had 3 television networks in the, till, I don't know, 20 years ago? I don't remember when cable started. But, there were people that wrote programs and developed programs for those 3 networks. Then came cable. Boom, right? When cable started, then all of a sudden there was this huge need for more programming and more writers, right? And then with streaming, even more. So right now it's the perfect storm for writers because you've got all these potential places to sell your stories. Well, in the music business, in the 20s and moving forward, there became more and more opportunities for people to write songs because they really needed them. People wanted to hear. And then came radio. That was like streaming now. Like suddenly radio was the thing. And the radio became, especially during the Depression, the major form of entertainment for most people. I think in 1934, I think the statistic is that 60% of families had a radio in their home. So again, they needed more music. And so you had these guys who couldn't get jobs because they were Jewish, but they were musical and they were talented, and doors opened for them to write music. So, songwriters begin in those earliest days, songwriters like Jerome Kern and Irving Berlin were suddenly made their way to the New York publishing empire, which was Tin Pan Alley. And so a lot of them got their start with the Tin Pan Alley publishing organizations. So that's a brief history. That's why there are so many of them that made so much music. So now I'm going to turn it over to you for a moment. If you know how to use the chat, I'm going to ask you to take a few moments and think about what makes a musical composition Jewish. What makes a song Jewish? Think about that for a minute, and I would love for you to write it in the chat, and then we're going to take a look at what you come up with. And I hope somebody puts something in the chat. Okay. So, reflecting Jewish words or Jewish values, using a minor key, written by a Jewish person, minor chords, values, telling an immigrant story, melody and prayers. Anything else? Roberta or Rachel, does anyone have their hand up? No? Okay. Somebody, what makes a song Jewish for me besides minor keys? Jewish stories and values. The composer is Jewish. The song is sung in Hebrew or Yiddish. Okay. All right. All wonderful ideas. Incorporating music of other minorities and the composer is Jewish. Clever lyrics. Yes, Andy. Very good. Okay, well, we're going to start. I'm going to share the screen now. And show you the three categories that we're going to cover about what makes a song Jewish. First of all, the musical Jewish sounds. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. Then another aspect that makes a song Jewish is that it expresses our history and the lessons that we've learned. And then third, it expresses Torah, the lessons that we teach. So the things, the values that are important in our Jewish lives. So we're going to start with the musical sounds. And I'm keeping an eye on the time because I could talk about this all night. Sorry. So for musical sounds, I'm going to begin with my very favorite 20th century composers, George and Ira Gershwin. And I can pick them because they're my favorites. They were pretty much secular American Jews. They were not immigrants. They came here. They were born in the United States. Their parents were immigrants. But they brought with them the distinct musical modes of Jewish tradition. And I'm not going to get, if I were teaching this as a really long course, I would get into modality, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just going to say for this class that there were a lot of minor keys, which I saw that come up in the chat box. So minor key, so here's major, and here's minor, right? So we have happy, and then we have sad. So a lot of our music is in a minor key. You know, we've had some rough stuff happen to us, so there's a lot of sadness. And then there's also a lot of half steps in our tradition. So so this is a full step, okay, and this is a half step. For those of you familiar with pianos, it's the black key in between the white key, right? So if we did half steps, it would be, and that's chromatic. So those half steps were not used as much in popular music early on, like before when I said the songs that were sung in people's homes. Let me call you sweetheart, I'm in love with you, right? No half steps, all in a major key. So the chromatic stuff, you want me to go to the next one? It has this push-pull. Chromatic makes you want to end it. So if I start here and I go, you want to hear the next note. It's just like a feeling that you want. And so there's a tension that a chromatic passage gives you. And it creates this kind of push-pull thing. And so Gershwin was very aware of that. And he used that in so much of his music. And so I'm going to take something very familiar to you, a traditional Jewish melody, very familiar to you, and then I'm going to sing you something from Porgy and Bess. So, Avinu Malkeinu, Chonenu Baneinu. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. Right? The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. For those of you who don't know, that's from Porgy and Bess. So he didn't just pull it completely from Avinu Malkeinu, but you can definitely hear it in there. Gershwin also admittedly adapted melodies specifically from Nusak, and Nusak are the chanted traditional melodies that we use when we daven, when we pray. My very favorite example of how he adapted one of our very familiar chants and put it in one of his songs. It's going to be a song from Porgy and Bess. For those of us now who teach our children the 4 questions of Passover, there's a melody that we use. But that wasn't what my grandpa taught me when I was a little girl. My Orthodox grandpa taught me, and in Porgy and Bess, morning time and evening time and summertime and winter time. So you even use the cadence, right? The same feel to it for that little snippet, that little passage in Bess, You Is My Woman from Porgy and Bess. And he knew what he was doing. He did that deliberately. So the other influence that was very prominent in Gershwin's music and in many of the composers of the day, the Jewish composers, was klezmer music. So I'm going to share something with you again. Hopefully this will work. Please, please. We're going to try it. And I'm not going to make it full screen because I'm really bad at doing that on the fly. So you're going to just have to hear it here. So get ready. Yeah, I kind of didn't know when to stop that because it was so cool. But that clarinet part, I actually was going to have Glenn play that tonight, but he said no.
This was better.
But this was better.
Yeah.
But you can hear the sound, that klezmer sound, right? So he was very much influenced by that and very aware of what he was doing. Of course, Gershwin is also famous for taking music, African American music, and incorporating those things also. But that again is another course for another day. But there are other composers that just did this organically, that didn't even realize what they were doing when they took something, a Jewish melody, and incorporated it into their music. So I'm going to share something else with you now. Hopefully this will work. Okay, hold on.
Linda, I think, oh, you got it.
Yeah, it's not the one that I wanted. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to listen to this for a second. We all know that sound, right? The sound of the shofar. Something that every Jewish person knows. Listen to this. For those of you who didn't recognize that, it's the overture to West Side Story by Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim. And that, I can't whistle. Can you do it? There's Glenn whistling.
Sort of like that.
It's sort of like that. So that whistling sound at the beginning was the sound, for those of you who might not be familiar with the story of West Side Story. It's modern day Romeo and Juliet with gangs in New York City, and that whistle call was the call of the gang, the Jets. That was their call, and Leonard Bernstein wrote that into the musical, and what happened was about 2 years after it started on Broadway, it was around High Holy Days, and he was a very secular Jew, really not very interested in his Judaism, despite his roots. And he had some friends invite him to shul on Rosh Hashanah morning, and he said, okay, well, I'll go. And he sat in shul, and he heard the sound of the shofar, and he suddenly realized that had been in his brain, like just, imprinted without him even knowing it. And that was where that whistle call came from. He didn't even realize he had done it. And not only was it, the sound was the same, the same progression, but it was used as a call, just like the shofar is used as a call. So I think that's kind of amazing. So anyway, so that is kind of an overview about melodies in Jewish music and what makes that music, what makes it sound Jewish, and what influences from Jewish music are in those contemporary modern Jewish compositions. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to open it up now if you would like to ask a question before I move on. You can put it in the chat. Roberta, it looks like we're good. Okay, no questions. That's amazing. Okay.
I've got a question.
Oh, somebody has a question.
I have a question. And this is just almost a joke. How would you incorporate the music from White Christmas into the Jewish tradition?
I am so glad, Norman, that you asked that, because the very next thing that we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about White Christmas. And I'm going to talk about other Christmas songs written by Jews, because there are more than just
That's
White
how good Zemer is.
No, Norman was my plant. I had him. I had him in there. I paid him a couple of bucks under the table to ask that question.
I wish.
Yeah. Well, I will be answering that question shortly. If you just wait, I'm going to share the screen now, though. So we're going to go back to my slide, and let's see. Oh, I can make it fancy now, I think. I'm not going to make it fancy. You can all see it. Okay, so we talked about the Jewish musical sounds. The next thing we're going to talk about, number 2, is the lessons that we've learned, our history, and how our history plays into the compositions that these geniuses created. So this quote to me absolutely says it all. It's from a man named David Lehman, who was the author of a book called A Fine Romance, Jewish Songwriters' American Songs. I highly recommend, if you ever get an opportunity to get this book. It's amazing. It's got some great information about the things we're talking about tonight. But the quote is, "Yearning is eternal, and sorrow never far from the moment's joy." So think about that for a moment. Yearning is eternal. We all yearn, we all long. And sorrow never far from the moment's joy. That is the kind of the definition of being Jewish. It truly, truly is. Because think about our history. I mean, everywhere. We lived in Egypt. Everything was great. You know, we were happy. We were good. And then a Pharaoh came along that didn't know Joseph, and then things went bad, right? This Purim's coming up. I heard Phyllis talking about her Hamantash, and Purim's coming up, right? We were happy in Shushan. The Jews were great. Things were great until Haman kind of started to make things bad for us, and then we were going to be hanged. Our history, we lived in our little shtetls in the old country, and things were good. We could aspire to a better life. We could yearn for something better, but life wasn't bad. And then the pogroms, and then things went south. And then, of course, the Holocaust, things went south. So we have this history of longing to reach a time when things just are okay and good and don't go south. But we always have this feeling that the shoe is going to drop or the rug's going to get pulled out from under us. It's a very pervasive Jewish gestalt. So all of these composers, particularly in the early 20th century, these Jewish composers, they had all just come right off of their parents, or some of them themselves had just come from a situation where the rug got pulled out from under them. So this idea of yearning is a huge part of the music of these composers, and a huge part of the choices that they chose to explore, the subject matter they chose to explore. And these songs became popular with people that were, non-Jews, just to the general public, because yearning and longing is universal. And during the time frame that they were writing these things, it was during the Depression or after the Depression or World War II. All of these people were yearning for things to get better. And so these compositions, between the push-pull of that chromatic music and the minor keys going into major keys and all of those things, and this subject of yearning, it just had such mass broad appeal that these Jewish composers became the prominent composers of their day. And there's a funny story about that from Cole Porter, who was not Jewish. He was an Episcopalian from Peru, Indiana. But the story goes that he was talking to Richard Rogers of Rogers and Hammerstein once, and he was not having a lot of great success initially. Cole Porter wasn't, at a time when Rogers and Hammerstein were having great success. And so Cole Porter went up to Richard Rogers and he said, I just realized what I need to do to be successful. I need to write like a Jew. I need to write my music like a Jew. And so after that, he wrote, my heart belongs to Daddy, da 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 da, right? So he just usurped all this Jewish stuff, this nice Episcopalian boy. And he wrote, I love Paris in the springtime, I love Paris in the fall. It all sounds like he's a Jewish composer. It has those same elements. So anyway, everybody wanted to be Jewish. But anyway, so I'm going to go back to, for an example, kind of I tend to do that. I wander because I love this subject matter so much. I'm going to go back to Gershwin for an example of this yearning stuff that I'm talking about. But now I'm going to focus on Ira, because Ira was the wordsmith. Ira wrote the words, and the push-pull of the music combined with the yearning of the words that Ira Gershwin imbued into these songs, you get an amazing product. So my very favorite song, even though it's kind of dated in terms of kind of sexist, I guess, but it's still my favorite song. There's a somebody I'm longing to see. I hope that he turns out to be someone who'll watch over me. Right? You can hear the push-pull of the music and the yearning in the words, and it's just so sweet. So sweet. I'll go back to Leonard Bernstein. Okay, so he's a little further forward, fast forward to Leonard Bernstein and the amazing Stephen Sondheim. Again, this push-pull of lyrics, of music, and then this longing in the lyrics. Somewhere from West Side Story, right? There's nothing more longing than, there's a place for us, somewhere a place for us. Hold my hand and we're halfway there. Hold my hand and I'll take you there. Somehow, someday, somewhere. It's got it all, right? The longing, the music, it's all there. Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Harold Arlen, right? Harold Arlen's father was a cantor. And so he was hugely influenced by the music that he heard growing up, with his dad davening. So Somewhere Over the Rainbow, right? That's the longingest longing song ever. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high. These are great songs, and they appeal to everybody because everybody has those feelings, right? But Jews, just because we had them on steroids, just tapped into that. And now I'm going to get to Norman's question about Christmas songs. What's the deal with Jews and Christmas songs? If you listen to Irving Berlin's White Christmas, right? I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know. Remember the old days when we had great Christmases together, where the treetops glisten and children listen to hear sleigh bells in the snow. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas with every Christmas card I write. Right? So it's all about longing and family and being together and just that warmth and those traditions. And while Irving Berlin might not have celebrated Christmas himself, he certainly understood the feeling of tradition and celebration together and longing for times to be good when you could all be together. And so, Norman, that's where that comes from. And same thing with Mel Torme, who wrote the Christmas song, Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire. Melvin Torma was his actual name, but Mel Torme wrote that song. And it's the same thing, you know, Yuletide carols being sung by a choir and folks dressed up like Eskimos, you know, just this sort of reminiscing about this wonderful, you know, idyllic time. And, you know, Melvin Torma probably didn't do that with his family, but maybe he had good Pesach celebrations with his family. And he was thinking about that when he wrote this Christmas song. Anyway, now we're going to, and I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that I get everything in and give you guys a chance to ask some questions at the end. I'm going to go back to our okay, so the last thing that we're going to touch on is the lessons that we teach. What makes a song Jewish? The lessons, the values, the ethics that are inherent in so many of the songs by these great composers. So while we think of social justice being at the core of protest songs in the 60s, and we'll discuss more about that in 2 weeks, these composers, these earlier composers, were certainly not shy about infusing their songs with messages of justice and righteousness. They took on subjects that had never been taken on before. Broadway musicals were frivolous and, you know, lots of frivol and kick lines and girls dancing until Jerome Kern and Showboat. 1927. This was the first time that a serious subject had been dealt with on a Broadway stage. And if you know anything about Showboat, there's racial discrimination, there's prejudice. It deals with all of that in a very serious way. And in fact, it was from Edna Ferber. It was from a bunch of stories by Edna Ferber, and Jerome Kern asked her if he could adapt it with the lyricist and book writer Oscar Hammerstein, who worked on this, and P.J. Wodehouse, and he asked Edna Ferber if he could do it as a musical, and she was like, absolutely not. This is very serious. I don't want dancing girls and what have you. And Kern was like, no, we want to maintain the message of your books and the messages, the social justice messages inherent in this. And we want to put that on the stage. And Showboat was made. Another great story, again, Oscar Hammerstein. He had a great bent for social justice. Rodgers and Hammerstein's South Pacific. Also a really obvious example because it deals with this American nurse who falls in love with a wealthy widower on an island in the South Pacific. It's World War II, and it was I think first staged in 1948 or 1949. So people were still thinking about World War II, and anyway, so Nellie Forbush falls in love with the wealthy widower, and everything's fabulous. You know, she's washing that man right out of her hair, and then she's in love with him, and then all of a sudden she meets his family and realizes that he had been married previously and he had multiracial children, and she can't deal with it. And so the story goes on from there, but you know, there's a great song that's called "You've Got to Be Taught." And so these guys were dealing with social justice from a very early on. And these were subjects that were not were not done by other composers prior to these great Jewish composers taking them on. So the ethics and the values of Judaism are imbued also in all of their material. So I know that tonight I've just really kind of scratched the surface of all of this, and this is what I'm going to call, these are the first generation of modern Jewish composers. But next week, or in 2 weeks, I'm going to move forward to the next generation of composers. And again, we're going to go from Tin Pan Alley, which was tonight, to the Brill Building, also in New York City, in 2 weeks. And we're going to talk about some of the great composers of the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and nowies and 2000s who are still using Jewish melodic influence, using that sense of yearning, longing, and even more strongly with this newer generations as they move on, dealing with social justice issues. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. And now I would like to open it up for questions. And if, Roberta, you can put it on gallery view so I can see people. Whoop. Norm has a question.
Always. You mentioned Cole Porter going to Richard Rogers. Was Richard Rogers Jewish?
Oh yeah, Rogers and yes.
Richard Rogers was Jewish? I thought he was Italian.
No.
Okay.
No. And hold on, I saw something in the chat. I need to move this over.
That's where I was going.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. So Adam Brooks, thank you, Adam. Your question is, at the time, was there anti-Semitic reaction to these composers, or was it just ignored or not known? That's complicated. It's a great question, and it's a complicated question. There was anti-Semitic reaction to the composers. Most of the people that just heard the music, just popular music, didn't know that the composers were Jewish. I mean, so there wasn't any reaction to that. It wasn't like they weren't going to listen to it. There were reactions to some of the social justice related songs that were part of the catalog of some of these people. There was a lot of racism. There was racism, and there was anti-Semitism. But I think, with a lot of them, I think it was like with a lot of the Black performers and composers, they were embraced by people, but they didn't want to have them home to their house for dinner. So there was a lot of that. It was very complicated. I can look into that more, and I think I will, because that's a great question. But I think that a lot of people just didn't know they were Jewish, didn't even think about it. So
Zemer, we had Mike Kornblit next, and then Linda Aberson.
I see. Okay, so Michael?
Sorry. Yeah, it's not a question, it's a comment, and it deals with what you were talking about. Go back to Rodgers and Hammerstein in South Pacific. The producers actually told Rodgers and Hammerstein to take that song out of the play. You've got to be taught to hate, and they refused to do it.
That's right. That's right.
We will not do the show then if that song is not in there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for adding that. Yeah, because that's a beautiful point. Yeah. And when we fast forward in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about songs that were written by Jewish people that were one in particular that Janice Ian, who is one of my favorite songwriters, she wrote a song called Society's Child, which was about an interracial dating situation. And I did not know until I taught this class in Kansas City that song, people didn't know I was started to sing the song, and they didn't know what I was singing because it was banned in many, many places. And it never occurred to me it would have been banned in Kansas City. And my husband tells me he thinks it was probably banned in Oklahoma City too, because he never heard it. So anyway, at least not growing up. But yeah, so there are a lot of people that didn't like what was going on. So thank you, Michael. Linda Aberson.
Wasn't Porgy and Bess extremely controversial with this?
Oh,
You know, you talked about problems from South Pacific. Of course, this was way before South Pacific, you know, with Porgy and Bess and how controversial. And, you know, race was a big issue in this, you know, and the fact that some people didn't thought it was an opera. And, you know, there's always that question, is it an opera or is it a musical? You know, that back and forth. The Tulsa opera performed Porgy and Bess as an opera. But anyway, the racial everything in that story it's quite not, I wouldn't say overwhelming, but you know, quite predominant in the whole story, the whole musical.
right. And there's a lot of controversy still about that. There was controversy about it when it was first produced, because of the casting and because of the type of music and the subject matter. But you know, more recently, you know, there were a lot of people who were angry with Gershwin and said he was, you know, it was cultural misappropriation.
Yes,
There's a
yes.
lot of that, and I try to look at that as just the amazing beauty of the music.
Correct.
And they live at the Metropolitan, was it last year? I think we went to see Porgy and Bess, a production of Porgy and Bess, and it was fabulous.
It's so powerful.
It is. So Sunny has a good question. Was Broadway popular with Jewish composers because it was the most prominent medium of the time, or was there a specific? I think it was very popular. It was a very popular medium at the time. There were, and if you wrote for Broadway, those songs would then spin off and become the popular music that was played on radio and in, you know, other places. Also, I think that for a lot of the composers, they like the idea of telling a complete story, not just one song at a time. So particularly if it was an important story like South Pacific or Showboat or whatever. But yeah, there was a lot of music that was coming from Broadway. That was a stepping point for the composers. So yeah.
Zimmer, the Metzes are next.
Okay, sounds good.
That was so delightful, made us so proud to hear about our musical ancestors. I was wondering if sometime later in this year you could do a program on the cinema and Broadway people such as Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, George M. Cohan, up to Zero Mostel, because I know we would all be just so feel so good hearing about that end of it. What do you think?
Well, I that is certainly not my area of expertise, although I know of all those people. But you know, we could probably find somebody who has a lot of knowledge about the performers. I don't have as much knowledge about the performers of that time. Mine is much more focused on the people that created the material for the performers. But I think that would be a great.
You would do a good job.
I think it'd be great.
Thank you.
I see something from Pamela. Yeah, that is another interesting note about West Side Story. It was originally going to be called East Side Story, and it was going to be about Jews and Catholics in New York. So that was its original inception. It's very true. Thank you, Pamela. There's so much great trivia for all of this stuff. Any other questions? I don't see anything coming up in the chat. Nope.
Well, Zemer, I I want to thank you so much on behalf of everybody. This was just terrific, and I learned a lot and enjoyed hearing the musical pieces that you shared with us, and the stories behind them and the history behind them. I want to remind everyone, 2 weeks, not next Thursday, but in 2 weeks on the 18th, the same link you used today. So please save that email. If you lose it, go back to the Jewish Federation webpage and just sign up again via the Zoom link, and you'll get the email again. That's how you can always get what you need, is just re-sign up. I also want to mention, as we're all learning through almost a year now, we're all doing more programming. And so please go to the Temple website and the Jewish Federation website and to our other organizations, because there's a lot more going on and there are great opportunities. So I want to thank my colleague, Rachel Johnson, for helping me manage the back end of everything so that we can let you all in. And thank you, Zemer, for just such a terrific program. And we look forward to session 2 in 2 weeks. Thank you all so much. One last sort of PSA for those of you who are still trying to get your first or second vaccine shot. I highly recommend you go to the website vaccine-alerts with an S, ALERTS.com. It is an unbelievable resource that if you're already signed up on the portal for the county, it automatically, either you choose by text or email, will give you sites and whether they're doing the first shot or the second shot. And we've been promoting it on our Facebook page. I know many have been frustrated. So please use that resource, vaccine-alerts with an S.com. You can go to the Jewish Federation Facebook page. I have it pinned to the top of the page for you. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.